There's one thing that I know is true about humanity. It's that we love to rank things. We love to make lists. We love to categorize and classify and quantify. And it's true for so many things, for sports, for music, and especially for movies. When you go to any of the major movie sites, Rotten Tomatoes, Metacritic, IMDb, Letterboxd, they all give you the option to rate what you see. And once you've rated something, well, you gotta rank it. And there are a few movie lists that I tend to look at in particular. The IMDb Top 250, the Letterboxd Top 250, the AFI Top 100, and the Sight and Sound Top 100. And just as a note, for the purposes of this video, I'm only looking at the top 100 of both the IMDb and the Letterboxd lists. And each of these lists has their own merits and biases, and depending on your taste, you could gravitate towards any one of the four. But what if there was a way to combine the lists to form one perfect top 100 movie list? Well, that is what I present to you today. The perfect list. Like a lightning bolt from the heavens, a true messiah of lists. I made some spreadsheets. Put together. But I do think this is interesting because when you look at the lists, you think, okay, well maybe there's like 150 or 175 different films. You fool. You child. There are 278 unique films across these four lists, just on the top 100. And in fact, there are only 8 films that appear on all 4 lists. 8! I couldn't believe it. And that's why I think this list is worth making, because I like 100 films for a list like this, because if you're getting into film and you want like a crash course in film, I think 100 is a really good number because that's something you can do easily in a summer. It's like a movie a day and you're able to get through it. And so I created this list. I took all 4. A film that is ranked number 1 on the list is given 100 points. A film that is ranked number 100 on the list is given 1 point. But, and as I said, I do think each of these lists has their own merits. I don't think each of these lists is created equally. So I weighted each of the different lists. At the bottom is AFI that gets 25% of the value, then IMDb at 50%, Letterboxd at 75%, and finally Sight and Sound with the full 100% of the score. So let's go ahead and start getting into the lists. Starting with AFI, there's a couple reasons it comes in at the bottom. One, it is exclusively American films on the list. And of course it is the American Film Institute, so they're focusing on just American films. But because of that, I feel like the placements on the list have a little less value since it's not competing with the rest of the world. Secondly, the list has not been updated since 2007. They originally made a list in 1997, updated for the 10-year anniversary, and haven't updated it since. And so there's a lot of films that aren't on the list. But even though it was updated in 2007, the most recent film is actually from 2001, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring. But looking at the list and getting into it, it is a very old school Hollywood list. Its number 1 is Citizen Kane, the old standard bearer. There's high placements for Casablanca, for Singing in the Rain, Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind. There are several Charlie Chaplin films on the list. There's a couple Marx Brothers films, a couple Buster Keaton films. It's very, very old school Hollywood. It has a lot of reverence for those films, for that era. But even though it is a pretty focused golden era list, the most featured director is actually Steven Spielberg. He has 5 films on the list, and even though he's not a golden era director, I think there's nobody alive that when you think of Hollywood, you think of more than Steven Spielberg. The list has some other interesting features. Both Snow White and Toy Story appear on the list. They're the only 2 animated features on there. No Lion King, no Beauty and the Beast. But I think it's because of their influence. Snow White being the first animated feature, and Toy Story being the first computer animated feature. And there's a couple picks I'm surprised by. Titanic is on the list, but again, being a very Hollywood list, it was the highest grossing film of all time at the time. It does make me think if they do ever update it, will we see Endgame? Will we see Avatar? I think it's pretty likely. Sophie's Choice is on the list, which, a good movie, don't get me wrong, but I rarely hear of it talked about amongst the great films. Meryl Streep's performance, absolutely, but usually not the movie itself. But one of my favorite picks for the list is M. Night Shyamalan's The Sixth Sense, which, of course, great movie. Don't get me wrong, but I think it's kind of funny with it being on there with sort of the crash that M. Night Shyamalan had right after this with The Happening, with The Last Airbender. But he was huge when he was coming up. After The Sixth Sense, he was slotted as the next Spielberg. It was when Jordan Peele made Get Out, and there was just all that hype around him. That's what it was like for M. Night Shyamalan at that time. And so he was able to carry that with him all the way up to that point, even after The Lady in the Water. So I think it's an interesting choice on there. I think if the list was updated for today, I don't think you see it on there, even though it still holds up as a really good film. Next up is IMDb, the People's List, and being the People's List is really one of the reasons it is at 50%. Obviously anybody can rate the films, and IMDb, like several of the other sites, has a problem of review bombing. Particularly, I think, African American stories. People come in never having seen the movies and giving them really low reviews, and it's a real shame, and it's hard to kind of counteract that. But you obviously get bias there. It also has a rating bar that you have to be at to make it to the list. And obviously you need some bar to get to, because otherwise the list would be nothing but, you know, locally made films with like 10 ratings, and it's all the cast and crew. And so you do need some bar, but it's 25,000 votes. And I think if you look at some of the films that aren't on the list because they don't hit that, I think it's clear that it creates a little bias against older films, against international films, which deserve that place, but don't get it simply because they're older or from another country. But like I said, it is the People's List. It has a very populist sort of feel, a lot of pop culture centric stuff. You get a lot of superhero films. You've got The Dark Knight, you've got Avengers Endgame, Avengers Infinity War, Into the Spider-Verse is on there, and I'm honestly surprised there's not more superhero content. I was very surprised to not find Captain America Civil War or Captain America the Winter Soldier on the list. But it also has a very 90s film bro vibe to it. You've obviously got stuff like Pulp Fiction and Fight Club and Seven, and of course, you know, that's great, but you also, you know, you get Leon the Professional, you get American History X, you get, you know, all of these very, you know, 90s centric films in there. And I think it extends into the man who dominates the list, even though his films aren't from the 90s, Christopher Nolan. He has 6 films in IMDb's top 100. It is the most of any single director on any of these 4 lists. He absolutely owns this list, but I think it's interesting. His last 2 films do not qualify for, I think, the top 250. Neither Dunkirk or Tenet make it on there. So he may be slipping, he may be losing the crown a little bit. But one thing I've always found interesting is the number 1 pick. Being The Shawshank Redemption, and it's been number 1 for a long, long time, and I love The Shawshank Redemption, don't get me wrong, but I never really think of it in those terms as being like the best of the best. And it definitely feels like sort of a consensus pick. While I definitely think the film is really well liked and really well respected, you know, I rarely hear people talk about it as their favorite film. And I feel like, you know, a movie that's going to be number 1 should be, you know, a lot of people's favorite. One of the most interesting films on the list, I think, is Hamilton. It appears in the top 100, which I think is really interesting, being, you know, a recording of a Broadway musical. But, you know, why not? But I think one of the most interesting features of the IMDb list are the international films that appear on there, because it's not the films you typically think of. There are some, like Seven Samurai, that appear on there, but some of your other big ones, the, you know, the big number ones, like Seventh Seal and The 400 Blows and 8½, those aren't on there. But some of the ones that do feature are Life is Beautiful, Dangal, 3 Idiots, Das Boot, The Untouchables. It's just sort of a random kind of selection of list. All fine films, but just surprising to be on there. And when you think of the, you know, the fact that there are only 8 films that appear across the 4 lists, you know, it's easy to say, okay, well, you know, a lot of that is on AFI for not having international films. But if you look at the films that appear on 3 lists, there are actually only 2 that are international. And so it's not all on AFI, and a lot of it is actually also with IMDb, not featuring some of those big ones that I mentioned. Moving on to Letterboxd, if IMDb is your film bros list, Letterboxd is definitely your film majors list, and you just have to look at the most featured director, which is Ingmar Bergman, with 5 films. You pretentious bastards. But I actually think it's a really good list, and I think it's evident when you look at the number of films that are unique to the Letterboxd list. It actually has the least of each of the lists. There are only 34 films that only appear on Letterboxd, so it has the most in common with each of the 4. Good job, guys. But even though it is a lot more balanced and it has a lower cap than IMDb does, which solves the problem of that bias against older and international films, it is still a people's list. It is, anybody can rate on them, and so reviews like this count as much as any other review. There is still a bit of a recency bias, just like with IMDb, and you just have to look at its top film, Parasite, to see that that's true, from 2019. But more than anything that appears on the Letterboxd list, I'm surprised by some of the films that aren't on there. Because like I said, it has this sort of, film major vibe. And when you look at, the younger generation of film lovers, there are a few filmmakers that are really, really well loved and really, really respected. I think Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, and the Safdie brothers. And they are not to be found on this list. No Midsummer, no Lighthouse, no Uncut Gems. They're not on there. And I was really surprised to see, I don't even think any of them are in the top 250, let alone the top 100. And finally, Sight and Sound's top 100. If you're going to go with any of these lists, I definitely think this is the list to go with. It's voted on entirely by film critics, and there are actually 2 Sight and Sound lists. There's a film critics one and a film directors one. And I definitely think the film directors one has just as much, if not more, merit. And I may include it if I update this list in the future. But when Sight and Sound is talking about what, is ranked as their top film, they're looking at the film critics list, and so that's why I went with this one. There's a ton of variety on here, a ton of unique, interesting films from a lot of different directors. You definitely get a lot of French and Italian films. You get your La films, La Dolce Vita, La Ventura, Lawrence of Arabia. It also comes with some interesting, experimental films and documentaries. Shoah is on the list, a 9-hour documentary on the Holocaust, which is, a beautiful, gorgeous film. Man with Movie Camera is on here. History du Cinema from Jean-Luc Godard. And similarly to the AFI list, it does have a classical bias, even though it was updated in 2012. Its most recent film is also from 2001, David Lynch's Mulholland Drive. Its most featured directors are Ingmar Bergman with 4 films, as well as Alfred Hitchcock with 4 films, including the #1 film on the list, Vertigo, which unseated Citizen Kane on the most recent edition. I think for the first time. I think Citizen Kane was the #1 on each edition of the list until this most recent one when Vertigo unseated it. And those are the 4 lists. Obviously all very different. Each has a different #1. And I think each of them, again, like I said, has their own merits. But before we get into the final list, I just wanted to take a quick look at the most featured directors across the 4 lists. This is a list of all the directors that have at least 4 films featured across all of the list. Obviously at the top you get Kubrick, which I think is interesting because he's not the most featured on any one list, but he is the most featured across all the lists. And I don't think that's a surprise. I think still in the general consciousness, Kubrick is considered, the GOAT amongst directors, so it's not a surprise to see him top that off. Obviously you get Nolan with his 6 films from the IMDb list. You get Bergman in there, who's the most featured on 2 separate lists, so obviously he's going to be on the list. You get Spielberg from the AFI list. I think it's a lot of names you expect. Scorsese, Hitchcock. I think Lucas is a little bit of a surprise because you have the 3 Star Wars films, of course, but on AFI you get American Graffiti in there, so he pulls off a 4. But you also get Masaki Kobayashi, who directed Harakiri, which I think most people have heard of, but he also had a trilogy called the Human Condition Trilogy. Each of the 3 appear on the Letterboxd list, so he gets in there with 4. But let's get on to the final list. After a little bit of math, you are left with these films as your 100 greatest films of all time. Now, I'm not going to go through and list every single one. You can pause the video, or I put a link to the list on Letterboxd in the description below. Please, take a look and follow along as we go through some of the more interesting features of the list. Let's start out and look at the most featured directors on the list. Here they are. These are all the directors with at least 3 films to appear on the final list. And topping it off, it's not Kubrick, it's not Nolan, it's not even Bergman. You've got Akira Kurosawa Kurosawa and Alfred Hitchcock. He has those big four, Vertigo, Psycho, Rear Window, and North by Northwest, which, always appear on the best of lists. This is the list broken down by decade. It is absolutely dominated by the 50s and 60s. 20 films from each decade makes up almost half the list. Obviously, the least represented decade is this most recent one with only 4 films, which isn't a surprise considering AFI, that list wasn't even made in this most recent decade, and Sight and Sound was in 2012, so no surprise there. I was surprised that there weren't more films from the 70s, because I feel like typically that's heralded as, sort of the best decade for film, but 11 films ties with a couple of the other decades. Next, let's take a quick look at our, 8 films that crossed all the lists. They of course make it all on there. The lowest one that featured ended up being City Lights at number 21, so obviously they all have really good placements. That's no surprise either. One thing that's really interesting about the list is, I think, where the point value ends. At number 100 is Woman in the Dunes with 49.5 points. Now, because of the lists being weighted, that means that all of the top half of the Sight and Sound lists automatically make it on there. And I think it's because these lists are so disparate, because there are so many differences and so many films that only appear on one list, they couldn't kind of combine in order to earn enough points to break on there. So Sight and Sound has a very heavy influence on this list, which, I think is valid. I do, obviously consider it the most, valid of the 4 lists, but I do find it interesting that automatically you get half the list on our final 100. And I didn't break the list down by genre, but I was excited to see, a couple animated films make the list. Spirited Away, which is definitely one of my favorites, Princess Mononoke, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse makes it onto the list. And just while we're there, another superhero film, the only other one that made it ended up being The Dark Knight, which ended up pretty high on the list. It's obviously very high on IMDb, it's really high on Letterboxd as well, and I think it earns a place there. It's a little high. I would love for it to be replaced by Logan, if I'm being honest, but I was just so happy that I didn't have to put Endgame or Infinity War on this list, and I gotta be honest with you, I don't know if I would have made it if I had to. Now let's look at our 4 films that top each of these 4 lists, and very surprisingly, none of them wind up cracking the top 10. I was really surprised by this. At the bottom is Parasite at number 25. Next you have The Shawshank Redemption at 17, Citizen Kane at 15, and finally Vertigo at 13, obviously topping the Sight and Sound list, getting in a pretty high place there. Our most recent films on the list, we have 2 from 2019, obviously Parasite, which tops the Letterboxd list, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Also, it only appears on the Letterboxd list, but has a really high placement, so it manages to crack the top 100. But let's go ahead and take a look at that final top 10. Starting off at number 10 is Steven Spielberg's Schindler's List, and it's the only Spielberg film that ends up making the top 100, which I was really surprised by. It has 5 films featured, but no Raiders, no Saving Private Ryan, no Jaws, just Schindler's List, which, I'm obviously happy about. It's one of my favorite films, so I definitely think it deserves that place in the top 10. At number 9 is Ingmar Bergman's Persona. That's his highest featured film. Again, a super featured director, and I love the film. I was really disappointed, though, I have to say, that Seventh Seal does not make the top 100, which is my favorite Ingmar Bergman, but Persona's wonderful, so I'm glad to see it up there. At number 8 is The Passion of Joan of Arc, which is just obviously one of the most beautiful films you'll ever see. Now, I will have to say, though, I've never watched it all the way through without the score that they added, a few years ago. I'm not entirely sure when they added that score. I tried to one time to watch it just, in complete silence, and it was gorgeous, but I just couldn't get through it in one sitting. So I've only seen it with the score, but God, it is such a gorgeous film. Some of the best close-ups you're ever gonna see in a movie. And it's 1928. I mean, just incredible. At number 7 is Yasujiro Ozu's Tokyo Story. Now what's interesting, this actually tops the director's list on Sight and Sound. So obviously, if I included that, it would have been even higher, but it comes in at number 7, an incredible film, just wonderful. And if you don't know Yasujiro Ozu, he never moves the camera in his movies. Everything is a still frame. It doesn't zoom in, it doesn't zoom out, it doesn't pan. It's just all these still frames, but they're so wonderfully executed. Just really, really gorgeous to look at. Just great themes. It really packs a punch. A wonderful movie. At number 6 is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, my favorite Hitchcock, so I'm glad to see it. And, you know, again, I think it's interesting because obviously Vertigo topped the Sight and Sound, but it's not one of those 8 films to appear on all 4 lists. Psycho is. Psycho as well as Rear Window. Rear Window comes in a little bit behind, but Psycho comes in there at number 6. At number 5 is Stanley Kubrick's 2001 A Space Odyssey. Again, another film to appear on all 4 lists, and rightfully so. Obviously, one of my favorite films as well. I was sad to see Dr. Strangelove didn't make it on the list. We did get 3 Kubricks. This is his highest placing one, and I was really glad to see a sci-fi film crack the top 10. We've got a horror film with Psycho, we've got a sci-fi film with 2001, so it's good to see genre making it in there.
At number 4 is
Apocalypse Now, again, another film on all 4 lists. Just, you know, absolutely incredible. And it's one of those movies, when I watched it, it had been, you know, so hyped up. I watched it a few years ago for the first time, and, you know, it's one of those, it's like, no way it's going to live up to its reputation, and it really, really does. I mean, it's just incredible. And Marlon Brando in that movie, you know, just with that little bit of screen time, just... wow! I mean, it's amazing what that man could do. At number 3 is Akira Kurosawa's Seventh Samurai. I don't think this is a surprise. You know, it's widely regarded as, you know, one of the greatest films of all time. My favorite Kurosawa movie. And obviously it's not on all 4 lists because it doesn't appear on AFI. But, you know, what's interesting, and we'll get into it, even if it was on the AFI list, even if it appeared at number 1 on the list, it still would not overtake our number 1 film. And getting into the top 2, and if you've been following along, I don't think it should be a surprise, we've got Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather Part 2, and finally, your number 1 greatest film of all time, The Godfather. These 2 films dominate the top of this list. They're the only 2 films with over 200 points. Seven Samurai just misses it. The Godfather Part 2 comes in with 208.25 points, and The Godfather comes in with a staggering 225.75 points. And what I think is really interesting is that when you combine these lists, there is no way, even if you didn't weight them, if you didn't do anything, for The Godfather not to come out on top, because its lowest ranked amongst the lists is actually The Sight and Sound, the one with the most points. So if you even them all out, The Godfather would still come out on top at an even wider margin than it already did. It is huge. If there is any consensus on what the greatest film of all time is, it's gotta be The Godfather. But what is also really interesting is that neither of these films, and again, none of these top 10 appear at the top of any of the 4 lists. And so it's really interesting how it turned out. And it does, you know, kind of, you know, wind up in that consensus because they're all so, you know, different. You wind up with these at the end, but The Godfather comes in really close on several of the lists. It used to be IMDb's for a long time. It comes in at number 2 on AFI's, and I think number 3 on Letterboxd. And so obviously it has, you know, just a huge place on all of these lists, and so it's not surprising. But one thing I think is interesting is that obviously Francis Ford Coppola dominates the top of this list. He has 3 films, not just in the top 10, in the top 4. But they are the only 3 films in Francis Ford Coppola's filmography that appear on any of the lists. It's just those 3. After that, he's done. Kubrick, he's got 8. Nolan, Bergman, they've got 6. Francis Ford Coppola, it's those 3, but good golly did those 3 have a high place on this list. But looking at the top 10, looking at the top 100, you know, I feel like it's a good list, and I hope it has, you know, some value. I hope people are able to use it as, you know, a really, you know, good sort of, you know, film canon. And obviously, you know, any list like this, it's still going to have its biases. It's still going to have its problems, except for this one. This one is perfect. I made so many spreadsheets. But no, obviously this list isn't perfect. Taxi Driver's not number 1. It's number 48. What the hell, guys? And I do want to point out real quick, when I made this list, when I made all the spreadsheets, it was actually back in November, so there will be some, slight differences than what you would find on Letterboxd and IMDb right now. But it wasn't enough, that I felt like I needed to update it now, especially since next year, Sight and Sound will be updating their list, and so, obviously since it ended up having such a big influence, it's going to, have some pretty, substantial changes for the list. So I look forward to, what comes out and what films kind of make it. There are a few that I definitely think we'll see on the Sight and Sound list. Parasite, I think, is, almost a no question. I think we'll see Moonlight. I could definitely see Shoplifters making the list. And I hope AFI, winds up updating their list soon, too. Next year would be the 15th anniversary of their most recent edition, and there are so many great American films that have come out since then, and that I think would make great additions to the list. Again, Moonlight would be one. I'd love to see No Country for Old Men, or There Will Be Blood. Whiplash, I think, would be great on there. But I'm excited to see, how it changes, how it evolves, if there are, other films like Parasite to come and really, shake up the list. And of course, I'm interested to know what, you think. Did your favorite film make the list? What did you think of the methodology? What other interesting trends, can you find in the list? Be sure to let me know. And as always, thanks for watching.